Welcome back to Simply Satisfied. I am your host, Greg, and today I'm joined by Bruce Chalmer, who is a psychologist, works with couples, and he has a really good phrase, 7 words. It's proven to be a useful, very useful guide. We're going to dive super deep into it today. I'm going to let Bruce go into that. But Bruce, before we dive into that, if somebody were to ask you, what do you do? How would you describe it?
What I do is I help couples try and heal from difficulties they're having in their relationship. That's
Okay.
one way of saying it. I guess there's other ways too, but that's the way that occurs to me.
And how, like, when couples come to you, what are some of the issues that you mostly see?
I see, I've stopped saying things like, "Oh, I think I've seen it all," because just when I think I've seen it all, somebody shows up and with something that, wow, I haven't seen that before. But
Yeah.
if you can imagine difficulties that couples have, I probably have seen things like it. Infidelity is huge. I've seen. I once did, for one of my books, I actually did kind of a little informal guess. I didn't really count up, but I think it was close to half of the couples that I see in the first session are dealing with some kind of infidelity, or perhaps dealing with some other sort of betrayal, or they're dealing with various kinds of incompatibilities or possible incompatibilities that they bumped into, or they're dealing with just sort of a lack of, the spark has kind of gone out and they're feeling really bad about that. Or they're dealing with kids issues, or they're dealing with money issues, or, I mean, as I say, if you can think of it, I've probably been dealing.
Yeah. And do you get a lot of married couples or just couples in general?
All of the above.
All of the
You
above.
know, 30 years ago when I started, it was more married than not. Now, again, I haven't counted. Still probably more married couples than not married couples. But, there's lots of folks. Well, these days, the rate of marriage is way down from what it used to be when I was a kid. So lots of people live together and have kids and own houses and stuff, and they are, in fact, not married. So it varies a lot. I see a lot of
Okay.
folks who are and a lot of folks who are.
Okay. I got you. And so you work with couples, kind of work through a lot of their issues, work through a lot of uh, maybe trust, but rebuilding trust. Talk
Oh,
talk me
yeah.
through that. Talk me through how you help rebuild trust or help them rebuild
Well,
trust.
therein lies a tale, yes. So just so happens, and I think you even knew that, it just so happens that my most recent book is called Betrayal and Forgiveness: How to Navigate the Turmoil and Learn to Trust Again. So I've given that a lot of thought. And, I think I'll even sort of preface my answer by noting, why would I write a book like that? It's because I've worked with so many couples over the years that are dealing with that, and I've learned a lot from them. That's really where I've learned, wow, how is it possible to rebuild trust? How is it possible to get past betrayal at all so that a couple can even consider the possibility of rebuilding trust? Because that takes a while to get there sometimes. So I think, in answering that question, how do you rebuild trust? I would back up a little bit. When there's been a breach of trust, and I'm talking about, serious breaches of trust, when somebody has done something that they would call a betrayal. You know, they've done something that they never would have thought their partner would do. You know, classic example being, as I've mentioned, infidelity. Somebody, their deal with each other is monogamy, which is still true of the vast majority of couples I work with, although now I ask it explicitly. I don't assume it. I actually ask. But it's still true for most of the folks I work with. And so they have an agreement about monogamy, but somebody violates that. And then it's an enormous betrayal. And the person who was cheated on feels terrible about it, usually, and angry and hurt and questioning their own judgment. How could I have not seen this, and all that stuff. And the person who did the cheating, if they're in my office, it's usually because they feel bad about it too. They're trying to do something that may possibly save the relationship. So there's an enormous amount of shock, in betrayal, and lots of stuff that people have to work through. And what they need to get to before they can decide whether they can build trust is what I call forgiveness. And in using the word forgiveness, I'm not necessarily using it the way everybody uses it. A lot of people use it the way I am, but a lot of people use it another way as well. So, and I don't know how far you want to go down that road at this point, but
I
forgiveness.
mean, we can
Shall,
open the
shall we go
door.
that way?
Yeah.
You opened it, so here we go.
Here we go.
Yeah, forgiveness. The way I talk about forgiveness is, and I didn't coin this phrase, but I like it. Forgiveness is an inside job. What does that mean? In other words, I can forgive someone who hurt me who doesn't deserve forgiveness in any sort of moral sense, who isn't sorry, who did it on purpose. I can forgive somebody I don't trust at all. I can forgive somebody I have every intention of divorcing or suing or prosecuting or whatever. Forgiveness isn't about that other person. It's not even about my relationship with the other person. Forgiveness is about letting go of the obsession myself and letting go of the anger, letting go of the rage and the shock and all that stuff that happens. And I, like so many people, like to quote the novelist Anne Lamott when we're talking about this. She has a wonderful line that she says, to not forgive is like drinking rat poison and waiting for the rat to die. It's like,
Yeah.
well, yeah, you're basically poisoning yourself when you're carrying around all that anger. And don't get me wrong, that anger is understandable. It's not crazy to feel hurt and angry, and all of those are very natural feelings. But to get to the point where maybe you want to consider trusting someone again, or figuring out what do you want to do with your relationship with a person, that requires that you get to the point where you can think about it without freaking out. And that's really what I mean by forgiveness. You can get to the point you can say, well, I talk about it as a 3-step process, the forgiveness. And I do love to point out, anytime some author, some clever author like me says, oh, there's a 3-step process. Yeah, right. Take it with a huge grain of salt.
Yeah.
It's not that simple, but it's a way of understanding the process that I find useful. So that's why I do that. It's a 3-step process. Step 1, I claim always, is you have to forgive yourself. Now, a lot of people would say, well, wait a minute. That no good cheating so-and-so is the one who did the cheating. Why do I have to forgive myself? It wasn't my fault, Well, that's true. It wasn't your fault. But when I get hurt, no matter whether it was someone else's fault or not, part of me is going to blame myself for not preventing it. Part of me is going to blame myself for not seeing it coming, or for, how could I be so blind? What's the matter with my judgment? I must be crazy or stupid or something. So forgiving yourself is always about, again, you have to get over the shock first, but it's always about granting yourself the recognition that you only know what you know when you know it.
Yeah.
And when you learn something new, especially if it's disturbing, it doesn't mean you were stupid for not knowing it. It just means you didn't know it. And people have all kinds of understandable reasons for not wanting to know certain things. You don't want to know that your partner might be cheating on you often because you've built a life together, and the prospect of that being threatened is really scary. So people have a lot of reasons for that. And when they can recognize, oh, I was just being the person I am, I was doing the best I could, knowing what I knew and not knowing what I didn't know. I was doing the best I could. That's what forgiveness feels like. It's that sense of acceptance that, well, yeah, I'm still a valid person. I was a valid person then. If only I had known, but I didn't. So that's what forgiveness feels like, to forgive yourself. To forgive whoever hurts you, I claim that's step 2. I claim that's a short step. Now, why do I think that's a short step? Well, because if I really am recognizing, yeah, I was doing the best I could, given who I was and what I knew and what I didn't know and what I was thinking, I was doing the best I could. Well, so was the jerk who hurt me.
Yeah.
I mean, they were doing the best they could on some level too. I'm not excusing it. I'm not saying there's no moral significance to it. Of course, I'm not saying morality isn't important. It's very important. I'm just observing that even good people screw up sometimes, even morally screw up. And why do they? Well, because, they're telling themselves some story that they later realize was a bad story to tell, but they didn't realize it at the time. Or they're justifying it somehow, or they're compartmentalizing, or they're doing all the things that people do to let themselves do things that they know perfectly well are wrong. But on that level, they're doing the best they could. The circumstances were what they were. The context was what it was. That's not excusing it. And that's a delicate thing to talk about with a couple, because often the person, if you're talking about infidelity, if the person who was cheated on will feel like you're just making excuses if you think about what was the context of our marriage. It has nothing to do with the fact that, he shouldn't have cheated. Yes, he shouldn't have cheated. But if, the context of their marriage was part of the story too. It doesn't excuse it, but maybe it helps understand it. Anyway, so forgiving the person who hurt you is step 2. And then I claim that it's also important to go to step 3. And what do I call step 3? It's a funny name. I call it forgive God. Now, why do you have to forgive God? First of all, you don't even have to believe in God to forgive God. This does not require a particular religion or religious understanding. If you don't like the term God, think, well, forgive the universe for being this way. Forgive the fact that we live in a universe where even good people, intelligent people, doing the best they can, sometimes get really badly hurt. And that just sucks, but that's the way it is. And so to be able to accept that, as not merely to accept it grudgingly, but to accept that it really can't be any other way. It's sort of right to be that way. Nothing would work right if that weren't possible. Religious folks will talk about, how do you explain the idea that if God is good and powerful, then how come bad things happen to good people? That's the theological question they call theodicy. And the classic answer to that is free will. It's like, well, we got to have free will or the whole business wouldn't work.
Yeah.
And there's lots of ways of understanding that. But that mindset of understanding, that mindset of acceptance that it's right to be what it is, that's what I mean by forgiving God. And another word I use for that is faith. That's what I mean by faith. So those 3 steps, and again, I oversimplify by calling it 3 steps, but that process, that iterative process, really, when you get to the point where you can think about it and not freak out, not be mad at yourself, not be instantly angry at whoever hurt you, not be mad at God and the world in general, then you're in a place, I'm finally getting around to your question, believe it or not, then you're at a place where you can consider, all right, what do I want to do about this relationship? Because if you want to stay married to someone, say, you're probably going to want to trust them. And typically, people in marriages, neither party in a marriage wants to be either the permanent villain or the permanent probation officer. That's no fun for either one of them. They want to be able to develop some kind of trust. And that, I mentioned that forgiveness is an inside job. Mm-hmm. Trust involves both parties. Building trust involves both parties. And it's always interesting to me because it's not just the one who was cheated on that has to figure out if they can trust the one who cheated. It's also the one who cheated has to decide if they can trust that the one who cheated on cannot be permanently angry at them, cannot be permanently punishing them. Anyway, I've gone on. You got me started on that whole long train and off we went, but let me pause for you to say something.
I love the trains. I love when people just take it and just go. And what you said makes a lot of sense. It's, maybe it's oversimplified to say it's 3 steps, right? But the 3 steps make sense. And then what you said at the end, that really hit home, where trust is it's not a one-way street. It's a two-way job.
Yeah.
Right. Where it has to be both sides. Because, whether it's infidelity or whether it's whatever happened or is happening, the person who is doing it needs to also trust the other person to not be angry the whole time, or not kind of have that chip on their shoulder, or hold it against them, or kind of play the guilt factor. And I think that's a huge part of it.
Oh yeah. Yeah, I just recently met a couple, and actually I could have told the story about lots of folks over the years, but it just happened recently that a couple, sometimes it's not clear whether what someone did should be, according to the 2 people involved, should be considered cheating or not. And a classic example of that is porn use, where men, as stereotyping somewhat, but it's pretty overwhelming. Men tend to be okay with it more than women do. I know plenty of women that are just fine with it, and I know plenty of men that don't, that aren't. But overwhelmingly, that tends to be men who like to look at pornographic images and get turned on by it, and women are turned off by the fact that men do that. Not all, but many. And so when a woman finds out the guy's been doing that, she feels often betrayed. She feels like, you're cheating on me. Like, how can you be doing that? Yeah. And the guy is often feeling like it's not cheating. He's not thinking it's cheating. It's I didn't have sex with anybody else, and I have no personal relationship with this person. It's an image. Images like that turn most guys on, So what the heck? So that itself is often a lot of the topic of early conversation around that, trying to soften up the categories so that both sides can hear each other a little. But the way that plays out in terms of trust is fascinating, because a lot of times what will happen is, let's say the guy in this circumstance will agree, okay, I understand how much you object to it. I don't really need it. I'm just going to give it up. And he means it when he says it. But part of him doesn't mean it. Part of him actually disagrees. Part of him feels like, come on, it's not hurting her. It's not hurting anybody. And so when she's out, he's going to do it. Or when she goes away for a little while, he's going to do it. And again, he's feeling like if she doesn't know, there's no actual harm being done. Well, then when she finds out about it, she's doubly pissed off. Even if she's softened up about the categories a little bit, even if she's feeling like, well, I don't have to consider it cheating. I just don't like it. But you lied to me. You told me you wouldn't do it. And then you've been doing it. And, what they needed to have done, always easy to say after the fact, the hindsight being 2020. What they needed to have done is have the argument earlier. He needed to have said to her, I understand your objection. I don't want to upset you, but I don't agree with you. So let's work this out. And again, I'm not presupposing that ends up that, okay, he gets to do it and she just has to, be okay with it at all. It often, you never know how that's going to go. But that's an actual honest conversation where he's not agreeing to something he didn't really agree to. And so often that, in terms of building trust, it requires that people be willing to have, the right kind of argument. And one of my little catchphrases is get to the right argument, because a lot of times they will argue about anything except the thing that's really scaring the living daylights out of them. I don't know what your language code is here.
You're good. You're good.
I can say scaring the shit out of them, right?
Yes.
It's okay to say that? Oh, good, because that'll bring up the oh shit moment, which I'll get to later on. So that's one of my other little shticks is the oh shit moment. Yeah, so it's, often what they're arguing about anything except what really is scary. And they'll find ways of avoiding it because it's too scary. And, to have an argument like that, the guy's terrified that she'll just hate him if he says he disagrees with her. And he loves her and doesn't want to lose her and doesn't feel like he's being unfaithful and doesn't want her to feel like he's being unfaithful. So he just lies to himself. And then that results in his lying to her. So that, that's a huge trust factor.
Okay. And you mentioned being able to get to the right argument. Now, two-parter. How important is arguing or being able to argue properly in terms of communication? And what is the right argument?
Great. Two good questions, right? I'm going to answer this second one first. What is the right argument? I don't know, whatever it needs to be. The one that's really causing the problem, and you can't always tell right away. But, that example I gave, it's like they were afraid to actually have that argument. And both of them were afraid to actually have the argument. And so the right argument there was there's this thing sitting there that is causing a real breach of connection. She can't trust him because he's lying to her, even though he's trying to tell himself he's not really lying. He's just not revealing it.
Yeah.
And so the right argument there was pretty straightforward. It's like, oh, you have a substantive disagreement. You better figure out how you can be okay with each other. And that comes up in lots of different domains. I'll come back to that in a bit, because I can generalize about, how do people get into that sort of mess,
Yeah.
Why do they lose connection in the first place? We'll get into that. But the other part of what you were talking about is how important is it to argue in a good way? How important is that for communication? That's one of my favorite topics. So here you go. You open another door, right?
Okay, here we go.
Again. Right. And here, I know probably most of your folks are hearing this rather than seeing it, but I am holding up a prop, which is the book I wrote before the one on betrayal and communication, which is called It's Not About Communication. Betrayal and Forgiveness is the other one. This one is called It's Not About Communication, Why Everything You Know About Couples Therapy is Wrong. What a snarky title. Is that a snarky title or what?
Yeah.
So that relates directly to your question. Because if you look at a well-functioning couple, now what does that mean? A couple that's happy with each other. A couple that has a good marriage, a good relationship, whatever you want to call it, where they, the sort of couple that is not making appointments with the likes of me, right? Nobody ever makes an appointment with me just to tell me how well everything is going. It just doesn't happen. What can I say? So I might take a jaundiced view of relationships. And I say, geez, everybody makes an appointment with me is having problems. Well, yeah. So of course that's true. So if you look at one of those well-functioning couples that aren't making appointments with me, and you're a fly on the wall and you kind of see how they communicate with each other, you will discover, first of all, you will absolutely discover, if you hang around long enough, that because they are two different human beings, they will have the occasional difference of opinion. That better be true. That is not a bug of evolution, it's a feature.
Yeah.
It's like, yes, we do well marrying somebody who's different from us. That's the whole idea of sexual reproduction. I remember learning that in high school. It's like, yep, by golly, it's good for species. It makes for species diversity. It's a good thing. So you're going to have differences. If you look at a well-functioning couple, how do they handle those differences? Well, they handle it with grace. They handle it perhaps with humor. Even if it's a serious difference, they handle it with respect. What you will notice is they're not calling each other names. They're not yelling and screaming. They're not totalizing each other. Do you know what I mean? They're not saying, oh, you're always this way and you're always that way. They're actually trying to make sure they understand what the other person is saying. That's what well-functioning couples do. So, therefore, if you have a couple that is not functioning well, and you teach them how to act that way, then they'll function well, right? Trick question. No, that's a fallacy. They're not communicating that way. They're not, let me put it this way. Those well-functioning couples are not well-functioning because they're communicating that way. They're communicating that way because they're well-functioning. If you take a couple that basically doesn't like each other, doesn't respect each other, is afraid of each other, is pissed at each other, is angry all the time, and you teach them all of those skills, they will be very accurately conveying how much they detest each other using those skills. You can teach them active listening. You can teach them I statements. You can teach them all of those wonderful communication techniques that everybody talks about, which, by the way, are all good ideas. I'm not saying they're bad ideas. I'm just observing that teaching those to people who aren't functioning well won't make them function well. That's what I mean by it's not about communication.
Okay.
So it's that, and people think it is, and of course it is. And I don't mean to be totally ridiculous about it.
Yeah.
It's probably 80, 90%. I don't know. I haven't counted, but lots and lots of folks who come to see me in the first session, and I'm, more or less asking, hey, what's going on? And they're saying we need to communicate better. Well, yes, I understand that. But usually it's not that they need to communicate better. It's not that they don't know how to communicate. They're very effective. The problem is they're effectively communicating a bunch of bad stuff.
Mm-hmm.
It's not how to communicate, it's what they're communicating. That has nothing to do with communication techniques. That has to do with, how do you feel about this other person? What are your assumptions that you're making? What is panicking you so much that you can't hear what they're saying? You can't even hear what you're saying yourself. That's what that has to do. So, and I should, since I mentioned that other book, I should explain the subtitle too. Why everything you know about couples therapy is wrong. Just a tad arrogant, would you say? Just a tad.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I do point out, and I love noting it because I do point out in that book, it's a spoiler alert because it's one of the last chapters. I point out, by the way, that statement applies to me too. Everything I know about couples therapy is wrong too. Now, wait a second. I'm writing books. I'm going on in these long narratives here that you're inviting me into because I have all these ideas that I think are good ideas, right?
Yeah.
I'm not claiming I don't have good ideas. I think they are good. If I start claiming that I know these are the right ideas and other ideas therefore are wrong, that is, to use the technical term, bullshit. And that's the problem, because a lot of folks go to therapists, and I say this with respect for my fellow therapists, and there are probably people complaining about me to their therapist as we speak, to people I saw one time complaining to their later therapist. I know we're all humans, but there are a lot of folks who get very doctrinaire about how to do the work. And, this is what's going on, and this is what is going to cure it, and, we'll tell you. And that turns out often unintentionally to do harm rather than good, because it makes people more set in concrete rather than less. And so, when I talked about that notion of the faith, the word I use, faith, and actually we can get into those 7 words you mentioned in introducing me. Actually, when I talk about faith, what I'm talking about is that recognition that, among the things that I talk about when I say accepting that reality is right to be what it is, one of the big realities is nobody has perfect knowledge or perfect information or perfect judgment or any of that stuff. We are all doing the best we can here, and it's not going to be perfect. And if you start thinking it is, that's when people do damage, when ideas harden into ideologies. When you're defending the ideology rather than sharing ideas, because ideas can be challenging. And when you're challenged by ideas, that's what causes growth. Somebody might challenge me with ideas that I disagree with, and I end up still disagreeing with it. But I've learned something by that process. If I am just defending my ideology and I can't hear anything the other person is saying, and they can't hear me, that's not a conversation. And
Yeah.
when that happens in therapy, it just causes harm, not healing.
Okay. And so, well, actually, I'm gonna go off on a tangent. We're gonna go to the 7 words.
Absolutely.
Because
Yes,
you mentioned them. You talked about faith, right?
Yes.
So what is the phrase? What are the 7 words?
Yeah. So I'll give you the origin story, and it's interesting because when you were introducing me, I your first question, like, what do you do? I almost thought you were going to say, how do you do couples therapy anyway? You know what I mean? Because you almost said that. I mean, you got more specific, but that's the origin story. I was in a consultation group. This is probably at least 25 years ago. I've been in private practice for 30 years, so maybe 27, 28 years ago. It was pretty early on in my private practice. And I was at a consultation group meeting, like, a bunch of therapists get together and we talk about our work, and it helps us grow. I was on the way out of the meeting. I didn't remember what we talked about in the meeting. It must have been something to do with couples therapy, because we were on the way out of the meeting, and this friend and colleague of mine, turned to me and said, how do you do couples therapy anyway? As if to say, obviously you can't answer that walking out the door, But I had actually given it a little bit of thought. I talked with my wife about it years ago, and I was thinking, if I really boil down what I'm doing, I mean, ridiculously oversimplified. Basically, what I seem to be trying to tell people is be kind and don't panic. That's only 5 words. If you count and, it's only 5 words. Be kind and don't panic. Well, what do I mean by be kind? I don't just mean be nice. I mean, it's like, the kindergarten teacher saying, oh, everybody be nice. It's not going to work that well. I mean kind in the sense of kinship. It's the same root, kinship. Recognize your kinship with this other human being that you have bonded with. Because when a couple is recognizing that kinship, that's what gets them through those differences without threatening the bond. Sometimes it can even strengthen the bond if they can work through it and still feel, wow, we can have differences and still love each other. That's amazing. It's really kind of cool. So that's about be kind. Well, you can't be kind when you're in a panic. And so many of the people that would come to see me, they're coming to a therapist because they're in something of a panic. And I'm using the word panic pretty broadly here. I don't mean literally, DSM panic disorder. I just mean they're freaking out. And when you're freaking out, then whole chunks of neocortex are offline, and you can't really feel much in the way of kinship when you're in fight or flight or freeze mode. So don't panic. When I say be kind and don't panic, many of the techniques one learns in learning to do couples therapy, when you get trained in that stuff, are all about helping people not panic. I think that's true in individual therapy too. The techniques I learned to help people in individual therapy often are lots of different ways of helping people talk about something really difficult without panicking, or process traumatic stuff without panicking. So be kind and don't panic was my initial answer to that question, and then I he said, well, that's an interesting way of summarizing it. And I would tell people among my clients, I'd say, I'm realizing a lot of this process is just trying to say, be kind and don't panic. And they would say, wow, I see why that's true, And then they would say, okay, smarty, they would usually be nicer than that. How do you not panic? And they had me there. It's like, okay, well, easy for me to say, don't panic and use all these clever techniques to not panic, but it isn't so simple. And I don't have a formulaic answer to how to not panic. But what I did observe is that the couples that come in with like really hard shit, infidelity, as we've already talked about, and various other kinds of betrayals, or somebody's got a terminal diagnosis and they're trying to face that kind of thing. I mean, hard stuff, the couples that could get through that in a way that felt like, wow, this feels like healing, were the ones who manifested what I call faith. And that's faith in the sense I described it before. the ones who could look at the situation and say, well, okay, this sucks. We feel horrible. And yet we got to take it as meaningful rather than insisting that it mustn't be true. The folks who come in, again, I'll go back to infidelity. The folks who come in where there's been infidelity and the one who cheated is saying, I was crazy. I don't know what I was doing, or I was drunk and I'll never do it again. And just forgive me and let's go back to how it was. And the other person is saying, yeah, you're damn right. And let's go back to how it was. It's not going to work. You can't go back to how it was. There was something important that happened. And the couples that can actually recognize that are the ones who can heal. That's what I call faith. So, all right, how are you supposed to acquire this faith thing that I'm saying? It isn't so simple as simply to say, well, read a book on it or, pray to God or something. It doesn't work that way, because what I'm describing as faith isn't something that is, it's not a thing you can read in a book. It's not something that it's accurate or inaccurate. To say that the universe is right to be what it is not a statement that can be tested for accuracy. There's all kinds of ways I can point to lots of stuff. Everybody can point to lots of stuff and say, well, that's fucked up.
Yeah.
And so, it's readily available. So that's accurate. But there's all kinds of things I can point to and say, but look at all the amazing, joyous, generous things that happen. Even in those horrible situations that happen, it often brings out the best in people. Often not, but often it does. Well, that's not inaccurate either. It's a question of, it's really a value judgment. It's like, what do you decide to emphasize? Would you prefer to think that this is a meaningful universe that is right to be what it is, or would you prefer to think that it's just awful and you just have to suffer through it? I would prefer to think that it's meaningful and and live that way. It's a mindset. And so to acquire that is not something like reading a book. It's really a practice.
Yeah.
It's something that you can willfully practice. You can say, okay, I'm going to practice this. And how do you practice any skill? It's good to have teachers. And it's not only people like therapists can be teachers of faith, although therapists can also not manifest faith. Therapists can just sort of write you off. That's not faith. But it's not only people like teachers, it's sometimes people like clergy, in a religious sense, although some clergy don't do that either, do they? So it depends on the people. But it's also people like, your neighbor who you just observe seems to be somebody who accepts the world and works with it rather than is pissed at it all the time. Or, I've heard people learn it from horses. There's some people, one guy came into me and was saying, my other therapist is a horse. He just had this amazing relationship with his horse that just sort of gave him that sense of, the world's right to be where it is.
Yeah. I love the 7 words: be kind, don't panic, and have faith. Right. And I think that they're not just for couples. I mean, that could be just in life.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I incidentally, for the benefit of folks who are watching this, happen to have it on a cup. This is the podcast my wife, Judy Alexander, and I do, Couples Therapy in 7 words. So we got merch. Be kind, don't panic, and have faith.
Awesome.
I agree with you. It's not just for couples. I think it's a way of living.
Yeah. And I like how you pointed out the difference between kindness and niceness.
Yes. Yes.
Because a lot of people, I think, mistake kindness for niceness, where they're just like, they're nice out of courtesy, or they're nice because they feel like they have to be nice. Whereas kindness, like you said, it has to do with kinship. It's like treating somebody like your actual brother or sister or mother or father, and like it's a little bit more than niceness.
Well, it is, and the closer the relationship. Well, I've noted this for years, and a lot of people would understand this as well, I think. One of the chief skills of an intimate relationship is the willingness to displease your partner, not because you're being a jerk and you're trying to hurt them just because it gives you jollies. Quite the contrary. It's the willingness to displease your partner by being honest about something that they probably won't like, but it's important to be honest.
Yeah.
If it's, somebody who's saying, yeah, I'm going to do something I know you prefer that I wouldn't, but I am planning on going to this particular, I am going away for a week to this thing, and I know you wish I wouldn't, and I know you're disappointed, but it's really, really important to me. and I'm sorry to disappoint you, but I'm going to do it. And to not, to insist that you never do that gets a lot of folks in trouble.
Yeah. And so when it comes to the couples that you work with, when it comes to being able to argue, when it comes to actually being kind to someone and, uh, not panicking, having faith, how much of that, and we talked about a little about communication, but how much of that is not just communication, but also a person knowing what they truly want?
Yeah, it's. I would even broaden it. It's absolutely a person knowing what they truly want. It's really about a person having a sense of their own validity. They're being willing to say, look, I know I'm not perfect, and nobody's perfect, and I know I have mixed feelings. It's not like I only ever feel one thing at a time, but to let myself know that something is really bothering me, or to let myself know that something's really important to me, and be honest about that. That's a crucial relationship skill. That's the foundation of intimacy. That's what I mean by intimacy, actually, is when two people are in intimate communication when they are both being honest with themselves and each other.
Mm-hmm.
And that's, that is often very scary. So I mentioned this, I sort of alluded to this a little bit earlier. One of the things I do in a first session, and my sessions generally, the first session is quite structured. After that, it's more like improv. I actually have a chapter in that book about it's not about communication, where I talk about therapy as improv, couples therapy as improv, because it shares a lot with improv. But the first session I do structure, and one of the things I almost always do, it's usually about 20 minutes in, something like that, after we've done some preliminary stuff, is I will say to folks, I have a way I like to think, to structure the first session that involves talking about what the needs are that we're trying to fulfill by being in a couple.
Mm-hmm.
And I talk about two sets of needs. And the reason I talk about two sets is the skills you need for one are very different from the skills you need for the other, even though they're both needs. They're both important. If they're not fulfilled enough, something's not working right. So what do I call the two sets? I call them stability and intimacy. And so, I talk about stability first typically, and, stability is probably what you're thinking. I'm using the term in its usual sense. It just means things aren't shaky. If things are perfectly stable, a couple probably isn't going to see me. You know what I mean? If they're not worried at all about the relationship, what do they need a therapist for?
Yeah.
Although I've had exceptions to that where it's like, well, they're actually pretty stable, but they're trying to deal with something that they want some advice on how to handle kids or in-laws or whatever. And sure, that makes sense too. But generally speaking, the folks who come to see me are pretty good at stability, even though, maybe they're worried about the relationship. Because, to show up in an outpatient therapist's practice implies, you're probably pretty functional in general in the world. I've met the occasional exception, but usually folks are pretty good at that. And, what are the skills of stability? They're all about keeping the anxiety level relatively low. So what does that mean? That means you more or less show up when you say you're going to show up. Yes, nobody's perfect, but more or less, you're more or less probably not having substance abuse issues, because that can be hugely destabilizing. Although I have to say, lots and lots of folks I work with are having substance abuse issues. So that is destabilizing. But generally speaking, if people are good at stability, it means that they're not cognitively impaired. They can manage to earn a living as well as they can, that kind of stuff. That's all about stability. So all those skills are about keeping the anxiety level low. You learn what buttons not to push, and you try to avoid pushing. You get to know somebody and you try not to push their buttons. It's just trying to be a decent person to someone else.
Yeah.
Intimacy is a whole different thing. Now, intimacy, as I was saying, the way I define intimacy is it's when you are actually honest with yourself and each other. And that's often scary. The chief skill of intimacy is to tolerate anxiety without freaking out. That is the chief skill of intimacy. And people often look at me funny when I say that, because it's like, wait a minute, you're talking about intimacy like sex, right? I mean, if you're having great sex, I guess that means you're not anxious, right? And, well, of course that's true. If you're having any sort of lovely interaction, be it sexual or emotional or whatever, by definition, if it feels good, then that's not about anxiety. But Intimacy also involves things like we were talking about before, being honest with someone about something you know they're not going to like. Something as simple as a complaint. It's like, hey, I wish you would do X, Y, or Z that you're not doing, or I wish you wouldn't do X, Y, or Z that you are doing. It's going to raise anxiety because who likes to hear a complaint? If a couple has a history of those conversations kind of going off the rails, like somebody gets pissed off or defensive or, and then they end up yelling at each other or worse, then they're going to be afraid to do it. So what a lot of times couples, because most couples do prize stability, especially when they do weird things like having children, they have children and not only have them, but they actually even give a shit about them. It's amazing how that happens. So I keep telling people, if you had kids, but you didn't give a shit about them, a lot of stuff would be easier. I mean, you might get arrested, but a lot of stuff would be easier. Nobody takes me up on that one. I didn't take myself up on that one either. Actually, I continue to give a shit about my kids, and now I have grandkids, and I love them too. What can I tell you? But when you do that, stability becomes really important when you have kids. So a lot of times what stable couples will tend to do is they will avoid the anxiety of being honest. And the problem is intimacy is also a need. What happens is lack of intimacy itself becomes destabilizing. And my favorite metaphor, and this is how I usually, wind up my little lecture on stability and intimacy, so I'll do that with you too. My favorite metaphor about this is a plant. If you have a plant that gets planted, a seed gets planted in soil, and it germinates and sprouts and starts to grow, then somebody comes along and paves a sidewalk over it. Well, why would somebody pave a sidewalk over it? Because they want it to be stable, right? They want to be able to walk on it, and the soil is more stable if you pave a sidewalk over it. Well, what's that plant going to do? It's going to try and crack the sidewalk or die trying. And we've all seen, cracked sidewalks with plants growing through it. That, for a plant, the roots provide stability, but intimacy is the energy for growth. It wants to grow. It wants to interact with its environment. A couple is just like individuals are that way too, and a couple is a living organism also. It wants to be intimate. It wants to have that experience of actual growth. And if that is compromised by people avoiding it, because of the anxiety, what will tend to happen is, metaphorically, somebody's going to try and crack the sidewalk. Now, what will it look like? Often the cracking the sidewalk looks like an affair. Or it looks like, anytime anybody brings up anything, even past the salt, please, they get into an argument. Or it looks like somebody getting very depressed. Or it looks like somebody all of a sudden, without any warning, just saying, I'm out of here, I'm done, I can't stand this anymore.
Yeah.
All of those things happen for couples where intimacy has been compromised. So a lot of the work, and the reason I give that little lecture, that mini lecture in the beginning of the work, is a lot of the work is about orienting people to understand that it's about tolerating the anxiety of intimacy. Because what we do in couples therapy, the therapist's job, one of many ways of describing it, is to facilitate intimate conversation. It's to say, wow, all three of us here are going to all actually, if we can, be present and honest and not get sidetracked by freaking out. And if you can tolerate that, then that's when growth happens. And it's, and it's really, that's partly why I love the work, and many reasons I love it. But one of the reasons I love the work is that it feels so generative when that happens. I'm not saying the work is easy, easy on the therapist either. It can be painful. It can be difficult. But when you're with a couple, even when they're dealing with really hard stuff, I almost want to say, especially when they're dealing with hard stuff, and you're able to get to these moments where they're just being honest and not, they're not being defensive and they're not being, offensive. They're just being honest, even when it's painful. Those moments feel really alive. And the three of us in the conversation are all thinking thoughts none of the three of us would have thought alone. And that's, so it's not like I'm sitting here and I'm telling them what's what. That, I'm in there as the one who's not freaking out, ideally. If I am, I'm not much use to them. But if, the therapist is the one in the room who's got the relatively calm nervous system and can therefore be curious as opposed to, freaking out at what they're saying.
Yeah. If I ever had a therapist that freaked out more than me, I'd kind of be like, I don't know about this.
Well, and look, we all do to some extent occasionally, because we're all human beings, it's why therapists need supervisors or, colleagues to process stuff with, because we all have our touchy spots.
Yeah.
And
Oh,
it can be, and we're often very good at not noticing it. And so
yeah.
that's, that can be a problem.
So when you have these couples that have stability and they're being honest with each other, but maybe they had just have too much difference,
Mm.
right? But they want to try and make it work. What do you tell them?
Yeah, it is simply not for me to make that determination. Do you know? I'm not, I don't feel, I am more than don't feel. I am absolutely sure, as much as I'm sure of anything, that I am not qualified to tell another couple they're incompatible or they're compatible for that matter. And it's funny because the longer I've done this work, I came to this conclusion probably over 20 years ago. The longer I've
Yeah.
done this work, the more I've realized whatever my internal guesses are about how's this couple going to do, are they going to stay together or are they going to split up? I don't even bother attempting to guess anymore because I've so often been wrong. I think my guesses are worse than chance. So you never know. You just never know. I will say, however, it often does fall to me to invite them to consider some stuff that they seem to be carefully avoiding for fear that it really, because maybe it's stuff that's been causing them problems and they've been afraid to talk about it. So I
Mm-hmm.
sometimes do invite that. You know, I don't consider, if you think about what is successful couples therapy, you find websites where they post, oh, 80% or 87% of our couples stay together. I don't consider the success rate whether they stay together or not. That's not what it's about. I write about this again in that same book, actually, the one about it's not about communication. That when you're talking about evaluating how's it going, there are three different opinions at least in the room. There's and of course mine being the least important, I would claim. I mean, I have my
Yeah.
opinion. If I think I'm doing harm, I bring it up.
Yeah.
Even if I think I'm not doing good, I bring it up. I mean, I bring it up anyway. My very first question that I ask a couple, right after I've done my little very brief confidentiality speech about the rules, like when I would have to break confidentiality if I had any reason to suspect child abuse, that kind of stuff. Right after that, I say, here's my favorite opening question, and I identify it that way. It's like, there's a zillion ways you can do this. Here's my favorite way. How will you know if this is helping? That's my favorite opening question. How will you know if this is helping? And I modified that from a question I learned from somebody, again, probably 25 years ago. But the reason I do that is because it orients them right from the get go toward constantly evaluating, does it seem to be helping or not? It's not like, are we having fun yet all the time? Because that's kind of awful. That's kind of boring. But it's just to make sure they recognize not only can they evaluate it, but they're responsible for evaluating. So, but what I'm saying is there's three different opinions involved, and often they are quite different. If I've met lots of couples where, from my point of view, it was a very successful therapy because they decided to break up. In other words, they were stuck. It seemed clear to one of them at least that, wow, this isn't going to work. And so the one who made that decision will often be saying, oh, I'm so glad we did this. This just so clarified for me. We're going to have to split up. And the other person may be thinking, oh my God, this was a complete disaster. I was hoping this would save our marriage. And I
Yeah.
respect both of those opinions, and whatever opinion I have of that is kind of irrelevant there. But it's like, I will probably be sitting there thinking, well, I can see why from that person's point of view is success, from that person's point of view is a failure. I've had the occasional couple I've worked with where I have felt like I don't know what the heck I'm doing that's helping these people. And they have told me, nevertheless, it is. So, and I don't disbelieve them. I mean, all I can figure is, okay, apparently it would be even worse if I weren't with them. At least they seem to think so. And they're rarely, every once in a great while, in a situation like that, I've been the one to say, yeah, but I don't think I should keep working with you. But much more often, it's something that comes up where I may bring it up and say, I don't know that this is, helping you, is it? And they will, we'll talk about it and they'll come to some agreement. And they'll say, yeah. And I will say, you might do better working with someone else. You'll get whatever you get from someone else will be different. Or who knows, something else, or give it some time or something. But of course, the ones that I like, the ones that I'm proudest of, are the ones that come in, and this is not that unusual. They come in and they're on the brink of divorce, or there's been infidelity, or there's been some huge thing, and they find each other again, and they feel so much better. And of course, pretty much the only way a couple heals from something like infidelity is if their relationship ends up better than it was before. Because how it was before is what got them into the infidelity. So if they're going to survive, it's because they've actually healed some stuff that needed healing. And it's so often. I've never heard anybody say, like at the end of our work, I've never heard, or even in the middle, I've never heard anybody say, "Hey, thanks for cheating." Haven't heard that one yet, but have heard many people say, yeah, oddly enough, nobody's ever said that.
Yeah.
But I have heard lots of people say things to the effect of, when I think back on this, we were really headed for a crisis we didn't realize, and you precipitated it. And I'm bummer that you cheated, but I'm glad we had to go through this because look how much better off we are now.
Yeah.
And they're grateful for it. They're grateful for what they learned by going through the crisis. I've heard people who were abused say similar things. I've never heard anybody say, "Oh, it's great that I was abused." Oh my God, no, of course not. But they've often said, what I have learned by going through that and healing from it is really valuable. I learned stuff I wouldn't have learned if I hadn't been abused. So I guess that's good. Yeah. Not good that they were abused, of course. I don't wish it on anybody, but the healing process really does teach. We learn more from bad shit than we do from good stuff.
Oh yeah. And it's the ones that you're working with that are trying to embrace that healing process, whether it's for themselves or it's for the couple or both,
Yeah.
But now I want to go off on another tangent because you said it earlier and I've been thinking about it since. Talking about the oh shit moment.
Yes, the oh shit moment. Yes. Let me tell you about the oh shit moment. Yeah, it's one of my favorite things. I've often pointed out, I'm sort of like a bad Borscht Belt comic, I have my shticks. It's like I go to my shticks like Rodney Dangerfield. I don't get no respect, whatever. He's got a shtick. Well, I've got a shtick. The oh shit moment is one of my shticks. So what do I mean by the oh shit moment? The oh shit moment is, of course, I'm ridiculously over dramatizing it by calling it a moment. It's not really a moment. It's more of a process. But you can see it often or feel it when it happens in a session. So, I'll be in a session with a couple, and somehow they will have backed away from the panic. They'll be manifesting faith, is in the way to describe it. And what will then happen often is somebody will be talking about something that's really painful for them or a way they feel about something. And again, they're doing it in a spirit of, I'm just being honest here. I'm not yelling. I'm not blaming. I'm just telling you this is where I am right now. And the other person will be hearing that. And there will be this moment where one or both is basically saying, "Oh, shit." And it isn't the oh shit when you hit your thumb with a hammer. That's oh shit. Ah. That's like something just hurt bad. No, this is the oh shit that says, "Oh shit, no wonder we're having this problem. Oh my God, this is hard." It's not aha, right? The aha moment is, eureka, I found it. It's a solution. This is easy. We figured it out. And, the cue the music and the cartoon characters and all that. No, that's the aha moment. This is the oh shit moment isn't the solution yet. But it's this moment where they stop squabbling. They're not squabbling in that moment. They're actually feeling like, oh my God, I can see we're both valid people here, aren't we? And the problem is we're both valid people and we have a difference and I don't know how to bridge it yet. The classic oh shit moment, which I don't mind saying I have a little bit of personal experience myself. And the story of my first marriage, I'm in a second marriage. I've been married for 21 years to Judy Alexander, who I mentioned. Well, the story of my first marriage is that both my ex and I went on to marry really wonderful women and we're both a lot happier. That's the story of my first marriage. So the oh shit moment I'm referring to in that scenario, which is not that uncommon. It happens to what happened to me. It's like, oh my God, I saw all these people where it's coming out of the woodwork, that oh shit moment is, oh shit, no wonder. It's not like, oh, there's nobody defective here. There's nobody broken. But we are not compatible to trying to be in a marriage, are we? It's that kind of oh shit moment. I see that with couples. It's sad when that happens, when they realize that. it's often inspiring in an interesting way. I remember a couple I worked with, a few years ago, where he was questioning. He wasn't questioning his gender. Like he wasn't trans. He didn't want to be. He didn't want to transition. But he had this urge that he'd had his whole life to
Yeah.
express himself as a woman. He didn't want to change genders, but he wanted to do woman stuff when he was out. And he'd only ever done it when his wife wasn't around and he was alone. He had hidden it from her for
Hmm.
decades. This was a couple that had been together for like 40 years, and they loved each other and they had a wonderful life together. And she was so, well, she found out about it kind of accidentally. And she was so supportive of him doing what he needed to do, but she recognized that her own sexuality, she just couldn't find herself be married to a man who wanted to present himself as a woman. She was heterosexual in that way. It just didn't work for her. She didn't disapprove of it.
Yeah.
She just couldn't wrap her brain around doing it. And she felt so sad about it because she loved him and wanted him to be, knew he needed to do this. He'd been struggling with this for decades. And yet she also knew that she couldn't stay married to him, and he wished she could because he didn't want to lose the marriage. And it was so, they were both crying, and I was shedding some tears too. And when they were talking about this, because we worked together for a while, sort of getting it to the point where they could talk about it. Because, when they first started out, it was all a bunch of squabbles because they weren't talking about that. They were talking about everything else. That was the elephant in the room, classically speaking.
Yeah.
And when they finally got to that, that's when they realized, oh, geez, this is the problems we've been having all along. We really find people, and mostly compatible, but it's awfully hard to have a marriage where they want it to be, have a sexual component, and not have that work because they're just not compatible. And that can happen with two fine people. So an oh shit moment sometimes lead to that. But also the happier ones where the oh shit moment is, oh shit, I hadn't thought of it that way. That's why you've been doing this. Oh my God. And then you sort of, it's this thing where all of a sudden you have to kind of go back and reevaluate everything. But if it's the nice kind of oh shit moment, what you're reevaluating is you don't have to be angry anymore. You don't have to be, in fact, you can even trust the other person now. It's like, that's why we've never been able to talk about this. I never understood that before. And then they often, they can connect. It's really lovely.
I love that. Now, as we start to wind down here, Bruce, I've loved everything we've talked about today, right? The oh shit moments, the forgiveness, the 7 words: be kind, don't panic, and have faith. But I have one more question for you, and it's the theme of the show.
Mm-hmm.
If you've listened to the show, you probably heard the question before. But what is something? And I'm interested to hear your answer on this. What is something, a lesson or an experience? What is something you wish you would have learned earlier in life?
Oh, yeah. Well, I wish I would have learned something that I don't know a way to learn except by not knowing it and then bumping into it, which is, it's really, it's the stuff that teaches you faith, or that forces you to either learn or not learn faith. I wish I'd realized that no matter how hard I try, shit will happen,
Yeah.
and that it's not bad that shit happens, even though it's painful. It's like, yeah, I wish I had been able to develop that kind of faith earlier on. And I say that, but I don't know that I could have, because we're all doing the best we can. It's they say, youth is wasted on the young, that thing. It's like, yeah, I couldn't have known when I was younger what it took experience to know. But that's certainly something I wish I could have had more of a grounding in, I suppose. I would have been more graceful in handling some of the stuff I've had to go through in my life.
Oh yeah. And I asked this question, but I think about it all the time. And actually, somebody pointed out to me where I asked this question, but every lesson or every opportunity for growth comes into your life right when it's supposed to. So
Mm-hmm.
it's kind of a not an oxymoron question, but it's kind of a paradoxical question to ask, because most people would say, "Oh, I wish I knew this," or "I wish I knew that," but like
Mm-hmm.
everything happened for a reason. Everything happened, in that sequential order for that reason, so that you can learn it, right? So it's funny that you pointed that out. Like, you know, you wish you would have, but also it happened this way, so you could learn it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, things unfold. The
Yeah.
the laws of physics seem to be pretty reliable, although there's these occasional little glitches that the quantum physicists are, trying to figure out.
Yeah.
Uh, and not to mention the theologians, and the religious people. I mean, everybody's trying to figure all that stuff out, and I don't think we are capable of perfectly figuring it out. But yeah, that's things unfold according to their course, and I'm not saying we have nothing to say about that. We have the power we have, but we don't have all of it.
Yeah.
And so, there's going to be stuff will happen that we won't understand. And I suppose it would have been nice to already understand that stuff will happen that I don't understand. And I don't know how you learn that. Little kids think that they can learn stuff and then understand everything.
Yeah. Well, Bruce, this has been awesome. Do you have any last comments or things to tell the audience?
I always fall back on the 7 words, right? Be kind, don't panic, and have faith. That's kind of if you, ponder those ideas, those 3 principles, and I think it leads to some, useful places.
Thank you. Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much for being on the show.
Oh, I'm delighted. And if, let me just put in the plug, if people want to find out more about me, it's brucechalmer.com is how they can find out about my books and my practice and the podcast that my wife, Judy Alexander, and I do. It's all information there at brucechalmer.com.
Yes, and I will put everything about Bruce, his website, his ways to contact him in the show notes when this episode publishes. So that will be all down there. Thank you again, Bruce. Thank you for doing this. This has been awesome. I loved every single, we could talk about this topic for probably days, but we have to kind of wrap it up. So
well,
thank you again.
It's been a delightful conversation for me too. And thanks for having me on.
Of course. And everybody listening, keep smiling, keep striving, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.